This is tape number 1 from the series, Shame, A Gift from God, The Legacy of Abuse.
This first tape is entitled Shame is an Emotion, just to bring it into perspective as to what it is. Let me time myself, okay. Let me first bring up the issue of codependence to show you where this whole thing fits in so you can have some idea about what I'm talking about. Let me define codependence. And this is just something I made up. This is just what I think it is. If I may be so bold to say that I think codependence is a state of dis-ease caused by child abuse that renders a person unable to do 5 different things in their daily living. Really, codependence is about being an immature person because nobody was there to teach you how to act like an adult. Trouble is, we grow up and act just like our parents. And most of us weren't raised by adults. We were just raised by children masquerading as adults who taught us how to be children, adult children. And that's the problem. Codependence really, I don't think, is about an emotional illness at all. I think it's more about our immaturity issues. Adults can do 5 things. They know how to esteem themselves from within, or in other words, they know how to love themselves. They know how to experience an internal sense of their own value. Adults know how to set boundaries with other folks. They know how to set limits on incoming reality, the reality of other people, and so they can protect themselves from other people. And they can also set limits on their own reality to keep themselves from offending other people. Adults can do that. They have boundaries. Adults can also own their own reality and share it politically with others. They know who they are, in other words, and they know when to let that out of their mouth and show people who they are. And they know when to hold it in and not display it. They know how the politics of displaying their reality. Basically, they know when to let it out and when to hold it in. Adults take full responsibility for their issues around needing and wanting. They don't have problems with that. They take responsibility for that. They don't whine and hang and expect other people to do it for them. On the other hand, they can ask others for help without shame or guilt. So they can be interdependent. And the last things an adult can do is they can be moderate in the internal experience of their own reality and the external expression of their reality. In other words, they're centered and moderate. In the disease, you see, codependents have trouble doing those things. They have trouble esteeming themselves appropriately or experiencing appropriate levels of self-esteem. They either see themselves as better than and have too much esteem, false esteem, or they see themselves as worth less and have too little sense of esteem and have trouble generating it from within properly. Codependents have trouble setting functional boundaries with other people. Codependents have trouble experiencing and knowing what the reality is and knowing how to share it politically. What they do is they share it with unsafe people and hold it and keep it in around safe people. In other words, they go into a market and then they pass through the grocery line. And as they're passing the bag boy, they inform the bag boy they're an incest survivor. In case you don't understand what I mean. Then they go to their therapist's office about an hour later and they sit in there and refuse to explain the fact that they're an incest survivor. So they withhold it from people they ought to be sharing it with and tell all these other people in their life information that's none of those other people's business. And they feel safe and centered doing this. Now that's ridiculous. Who does that kind of thing? A very immature person that doesn't know how to be political with their own reality. That was a very hard one to learn. I kept doing it a little different. I'd share it with offenders who'd take the information and blast me back in the face with it. And then people who weren't really victimizing me, I'd withhold it from and be real paranoid around them. It's absolutely crazy. Codependents have trouble addressing their adult issues around needing and wanting. What they do is again seen in 2 extremes. They either are too dependent, expecting others to take care of their needs and wants, or they're anti-dependent. In other words, they know what they need and want, and they'll be doggone if they'll let anybody help them with that. Most men fall in that second category, and most women fall in the first, at least from about 35 on up in this culture. We also have another, in terms of those issues around dependency, needs, and wants, there's another extreme that's seen in the disease. It kind of falls in that anti-dependent category, and that's the codependent who's needless and wantless. That's the sickest one of all when we look at this particular symptom. And that's the one that has no idea whatsoever what their needs and wants are. They just kind of get them met by taking care of other people. And they're needless and wantless. These are the people that really fail to ever take care of themselves. and codependents have a hard time dealing with their reality in moderation. Inside themselves, their reality is experienced as very shut down or booming. In other words, when they tune into themselves, they can barely get a grasp of it. They don't really know who they are, or it's booming. It's like they don't feel anything at all, or they're raging inside. Then when they go to express it, they either let it out in a peep or they let it out in a roar, so they offend other people with their reality. Letting it out with a peep is just as offensive as letting it out with a roar. Have you ever heard anybody letting their reality out with a peep? Like that? What do you do when somebody goes, peep? What do you do when they do that? You strain. You try to get right up near them to hear what in the world they're saying. Pretty soon you're screaming, and they're getting more silent. And then they accuse you of offending them. But what started the whole thing in the first place is they either didn't let it out or they let it out in a peep. So how you experience it internally and how you let it out is part of the disease, when inside it's all up or all down, and you let it out all down or all up. Both are equally as sick as the other. One just looks better than the other. That's the disease of codependence. And the reason why I brought it up before I went into other issues around shame as an emotion is because I'm going to refer to these symptoms many times to show you how shame is interrelated with this symptomatology. There are also 5 other secondary symptoms, what I call secondary symptoms of this disease. And I want to pass by those real quickly, but I'm not going to be discussing them at all. The secondary symptoms have to do with control issues. Control is about, in the disease, is about giving yourself permission to tell somebody else who they ought to be, what they ought to look like, what they ought to be thinking, what they ought to be feeling, and what they ought to be doing or not doing. You're in your disease whenever you're doing that. But it's a secondary symptom caused by not knowing who you are, boundary failure, and lack of appropriate levels of self-esteem. The second secondary symptom is that codependents have problems with resentments, adult resentment issues. The third symptom, secondary symptom, is codependents by and large have spirituality issues. The fourth secondary symptom is that codependents avoid reality through the use of addictions, physical illness, and mental illness. We can get so crazy we don't even know what reality is. That's what mental illness oftentimes is about in this disease. We can also get physically ill from not facing reality, and we can use addictions to avoid reality. I see it as a secondary symptom, although it becomes a primary issue if you are suffering from addiction issues and trying to recover from codependence, certainly. Since codependency recovery is about growing up, in my opinion, and facing reality, how can you face reality if you use addictions to avoid reality? Which is one of the key problems in recovery, because so often we go into addictions treatment first and then try to do codependence treatment, but what we do is we go from addiction to addiction to addiction to addiction, all the time avoiding reality and expecting to get into codependence recovery. You got to have reality on board. You can't be medicating reality through a use of addiction if you want to face your codependence issues. Codependency recovery, really more than anything else at all, is about facing reality, not avoiding it. If you're using addictions to medicate reality, you can forget codependence recovery. But anyway, codependence recovery is about growing up, facing reality, grieving, reparenting the self, and forgiving others who have offended you in your family of origin and in your adult life too. And forgiving yourself for the harmful effects of being a codependent in the first place, and there are many harmful effects from your codependency on others and yourself. So codependence recovery is a mammoth job. Understanding shame and codependence is part of that recovering process. Now let's just go on. I want to go on now and just discuss the issue of shame and put it into perspective. What we're talking about when we talk about shame is we're merely talking about emotion. Where it fits in on these primary symptoms is right in here under reality. Shame is part of your reality, and it is simply an emotion and nothing else. It's not anything woo or special at all. It's just an emotion. Emotions, if you're normal, not codependent, come from your thinking. As you think, you create your emotions. As you think certain things, you will generate the experience of shame. Now, just as a mention here about feeling reality and that third core symptom, let me say something else about emotions in general. Emotions are just, as I said before, one part of our reality. Our reality has 4 parts to it, and our reality makes up a sense of who we are. Emotions then are just a fourth of who we are, but they're extremely important because each one of them brings us certain gifts. Probably the main gift your emotions bring you is a sense of aliveness, which is very, very important. It's how we connect to the world through our bodies. You know, if you just spin around in your thinking, does it really matter? Have you ever thought about that? If you just stay up in your brain, what matters? Nothing matters at all if you stay up in your brain and don't feel. It's only when we get our brain connected to our feeling reality that we really have a reaction to whatever is going on in our environment. So our emotions are a way that we connect our bodies to the world and have a sense of aliveness, and that's very important. The other thing our emotions do is each one brings us gift, but we have a problem in this culture. It's part of the issue around child abuse. We have a problem with our culture and emotions in that there is a general attitude in this culture that to feel is immature. How many people in here are struggling to feel as part of their codependence recovery? Yeah. We have an attitude in this culture that if you feel at all, you're immature. If you feel moderately, you're emotional. And if you feel strongly, you've gone into the realm of craziness. What does that do for us in terms of recovering from this disease? It keeps us from feeling our feelings. That's why most people can't feel them, because they not only have been told to sit down, shut up, and don't express them, they've also learned to tune their emotions out, because their emotions is what brings reality to them, and they don't want to face reality. And the third reason is there's a general attitude in this culture that to have feelings somehow is very immature. And what I know is in recovery, since I believe recovery from codependence is about growing up, having your emotions is indeed about your maturity. It takes a mature person to feel their feelings. It takes a mature person, too, to control them and not let them out in such a way that they offend other people with them. But anyway, there is that general attitude that really serves to keep people really shut down with their emotions. There's also some other crazy deals about emotions in general, and that is that some emotions men aren't to have, and some emotions women aren't to have, and some emotions nobody's to have, which is really screwball. In this culture, generally speaking, we say that women aren't to be angry, that if a woman is angry, she's a witch, or something worse than that. But when I get taped, I don't swear, I won't say it. But anyway, most people consider an angry woman a witch. Men aren't to have fear, on the other hand. If you're a male and you have fear, you're a big coward. So individually in this culture, we rob people of their emotions in general, and then specific, taking fear from men and anger from women. So they're missing parts of who they are. The third crazy thing about this is that no one is to feel their pain, which is probably why codependence is rampant. Nobody's to feel pain, and everybody has a God-given right to medicate it away, no matter in any fashion you can do it. All you have to do is watch the TV for a while and see how much invitations we get to shut down our pain. The other emotion that is absolutely totally avoided is the emotion of shame. It's even buried deeper than pain. Pain we get an invitation to not experience, but with shame we don't even talk about it. It's only recently that we've been talking about it. I know where I'm from, we've been talking about shame for 10, 12 years, but I remember years and years and years we were blabbing away about it, but nobody else was ever mentioning it. Now I can see it start coming into the literature. You hear it on the TV, you see it in movies, which is really shocking. I know who's ever writing that script is a codependent in recovery. It's really kind of strange. They're talking about shame, but that is a recent experience. Up until very recently, shame was not mentioned, which is a problem. So we've gotten a huge invitation not to experience that at all. Now, to kind of straighten out this experience of feelings, when I'm working with a codependent and helping them pull out of that and begin to own their own feeling reality over here and teach them that as they think they produce their feeling realities, one of the things I do is introduce a principle around feelings, and that principle is this: all our feelings are wonderful. There's nothing wrong with any one of our feelings. It's actually only when we carry take on feelings from other people and add them to our own, that we go on overwhelm, and the feeling experience of our own plus somebody else's makes us feel awful. When we're just feeling our own emotions and nobody else's, most of us find that we can stand them. In fact, I've gone through some really crazy experiences with people. You know, I have dealt with people over the years that have never felt a feeling. And then we come along, or I come along, and I teach somebody how to feel their feelings. Do you know how to feel your feelings? Do you know how to go back and feel your feelings when you can't feel them? Do you know how to do that? Anybody ever tell you how? It's real simple. If you pay attention to your physical body, you will find out that when you are feeling a feeling that your brain won't tell you what it is, just pay attention to what's going on with your body. You can begin to tell what you're feeling. For example, generally speaking, when you're feeling your own shame, you feel kind of hot behind your face. When you're feeling fear, you kind of have a general spreading feeling through your chest. When you're feeling pain, oftentimes your heart hurts. Feel shame, you kind of, or guilt, you have kind of a gnawing feeling in your gut. A lot of times to get our emotions back, to know what they really are, we have to start paying attention to our own anatomy and physiology in order to figure out what they are. If you start tuning into that, your mind will begin to understand what these emotions are, because your body will be feeling them whether your brain is tuned into it or not. Anyway, getting back to the emotions, what I teach people is all their feelings are wonderful and they must learn how to embrace them and express them appropriately. Each one brings us a gift. I make them memorize this so they don't avoid them, and they start paying attention to them. The reason why I tell them to pay attention to them is because each emotion helps us deal with what's going on in our life. It's our emotions that tell us really what's going on. For example, and by the way, I teach people to think about these in terms of 7 emotions and not worry about all those others, which are generally either one of these basic 7 feelings or a combination of these basic 7 feelings, and I'll tell you they come in pairs. The first 2 I always think about that come together are pain and joy. Those 2 are bedfellows. Pain and joy, oftentimes they're felt at the same time. The gift of our pain is that it helps us change. Without pain, none of us would ever change. In other words, pain is probably the emotion that does more for us than any other emotion in recovery, because what do we have to do in recovery from codependence? We have to grow up and stop blaming other people for our problems. Pain is the one motivator that will help people do that. I have never met anybody, like at the Meadows, who came in for treatment, that got anywhere in treatment when they could not feel their own pain. Without pain, you can't do any of the job of treatment or growing up or anything. You got to be in enough pain to do that. So the gift pain gives us is a gift of growth. And it's a wonderful emotion. Oh, I know what I wanted to tell you. I've dealt with people that I was trying to make, feel their feelings again. They call me up on the phone and say, I'm hurting. I said, what are you hurting about? And then they give this long line of all this stuff they're hurting about. I said, oh, goody, goody. They say, what do you mean? I said, it's your own pain. You can stand it now. Call me back tomorrow, and between now and then, just keep telling yourself, this is my pain and I can stand it. This is my pain and I can stand it. This is my anger and I can stand it. This is my guilt and I can stand it. This is my joy and I can stand it. And you will find by tomorrow you can stand it. They call me back tomorrow and say, how you doing? I could stand it as long as I kept telling myself I could stand my own feelings. That's another trick to use on yourself. As long as it's your own feeling, let me tell you, you can stand it, and you better learn to stand it, because without them, you're not going to get anywhere in this world. But the gift of our pain is that of growth. The gift from our joy is hope. It's our joy that gives us hope, which is a wonderful emotion. The next 2 that kind of go together are anger and fear for some reason. Oftentimes, those are imbalanced too. If you feel more powerful than something coming at you, you get angry. If you feel less powerful, you get fearful. That's kind of how the 2 of them go together. But anyway, our anger gives us power. Our anger gives us power and energy. Have you ever noticed when you're really ticked off how fast you cleaned your house? When I'm really ticked off and mumbling under my breath about what an SOB, dab, 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 dab is, I can clean my house in about 2 hours. And if I don't have that as a motivator, it generally takes me about a day, day and a half. Anger is a motivator. By the way, anger is a wonderful thing. I have developed literally everything that I know out of resentment. Resentment is just another fancy term for being angry. All my recovery, either from my addiction issues or from my codependence, is on a resentment. So I don't see resentments as terrible things unless you're spinning around trying to figure out how to get somebody sufficiently punished and giving yourself an ulcer over it. Other than that, resentments, because it is about anger, can be very beneficial for us because they're motivating. They're motivating, and anger gives you a sense of power, which helps you also protect yourself. But anyway, fear, on the other hand, alerts us to danger in our environment and allows us to what? Protect ourselves. Protect ourselves. Fear is a wonderful emotion. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. It tells us that there is something dangerous in our environment, and we'd better take a look at that and stop avoiding facing whatever it is. The next two emotions that go together are shame and guilt. The gift of guilt is that it brings us our values and our integrity. Shame is a gnawing feeling in the gut that comes about whenever you're breaking your own rules or operating outside your own value system. So as we feel guilt, our brain can automatically tell us that something's going on where we're breaking our own rules, and if we want to have integrity and follow our values, we've got to stop whatever we're doing. Shame, on the other hand, is another issue I'm not going to go into right at the moment. But shame and guilt kind of go together and often are very, very, very confused. Remember this, though, for when I'm going on later, that when you experience your own guilt, it is simply a gnawing feeling in the gut that alerts you to the fact that something's wrong, that you're not following your own rules. The last emotion that I discuss and teach people to start tracking, which everybody can track most of the time, is lust. Lust is emotion, too, that comes about from what you're thinking. And when you're thinking, when your brain is telling you that you're looking at something that is sexually inviting to you, then what's going to happen is you'll start to feel the emotion of lust. So it's another very, very important emotion. And by the way, I don't have time to invite you to answer questions around that stuff in this particular tape series. But I will tell you, I go down through those lists of emotions all the time with people, and I don't tell them about lust. And then I say, what other emotions do you think? There's one more that I would talk about. Nobody ever gets it. That's another emotion that we treat just like shame. It's like, you're not to talk about it. Don't mention it. We all do it, but don't let anybody know you do it. Which is crazy. Just nuts. You better pay attention to when that's going on so you can control it. Or increase it according to what's safe or appropriate. If you don't pay attention to it and it's going on, you're going to be in deep trouble. That's a very, very powerful emotion. You better pay attention to it. It alerts you to the fact that something in your environment is sexually arousing. It's a wonderful emotion, just like any of those other emotions. But what needs to be in recovery is that we need to be able to set limits on those emotions, so we don't let them out into our environment in such a way that we offend people with the expression of our emotion or the behavior surrounding it. We have data coming into our brains all the time. We assign meaning to that data. As we assign meaning to that data, which is called our thinking, we create our emotions. That's the connection. I'll tell you, in recovery, when our thinking is straightened out because we've reduced the amount of immature thinking we indulge ourselves in, and we're also connected to our emotions, we get that wonderful experience called being centered in recovery that makes most people feel like an adult. Getting our thinking straightened out and connected to our emotions, and all 7 emotions, is an extremely important part of our recovering process. Now I want to tell you something about this too. It's kind of a bias of mine. I find it really irritating. Now that I got over it, naturally, I can do an inventory on you. One of the things that I notice is that people judge their recovery by how much joy they have in their life. Are you all doing that too? It's like you don't have recovery because you're not happy? Yeah. Now that's immature thinking. It is immature thinking. Thank you very much. I always like people who support me. Have my bias. If we just whittle our emotions down to 7, and we rattle all those off, pain and joy and fear and anger and shame and guilt and lust, why should you feel joy more than you feel the rest of those? It's immature thinking to think that you're going to feel joy more than 1/7 of the time. In recovery, if you're doing recovery, you're going to be experiencing all those emotions. And you shouldn't be experiencing one more than the other. In other words, you're going to have about as much pain in your life as you're going to have joy in your life, as you're going to have shame in your life, as you're going to have guilt in your life, as you're going to have lust in your life. Hopefully that's another wonderful emotion, as long as you don't let it out of control. In other words, don't gauge, I would tell you not to engage your recovery by how much joy you have. That's just one emotion, and normal people only get that a seventh of the time. Just like, and they live within that parameter. And I think if you can remove the cultural bias about emotions are a terrible thing and just let yourself feel them and say to yourself, hey, this is okay. It's only fear. It's only anger. It's only lust. It's only this, that, and the other thing. And hey, now I get some joy. Isn't that wonderful? But recovery's about feeling all that stuff. Are you going to get into balance? I will tell you that's been an important part of my own recovery. I used to have that bias that if I wasn't happy, something was wrong and I wasn't in recovery. And I have found in recovery I feel all that stuff, and now instead of, it was just happened today at the dinner table and Pat and I were eating, he brought up something that irritates me and also brings me some pain, and I was sitting there going, God, I don't like this, and look how centered he is as he's talking about all this stuff, and he was a little bit angry and in some pain. And I'm going, I shouldn't be feeling this anger, I shouldn't be having this pain, and I'm thinking, oh, wait a minute. Feeling some anger and some pain about what he's talking about is normal. Why don't you just say to yourself, you can stand this and get centered and go on like any other adult does. And I recentered myself in doing that, made myself feel better. Gotta get used to the levels of these emotions we're gonna have. We're gonna have all of them if we're tuned into ourselves. Normal people feel all that. I have a motto that I got, I think I heard it first from Pat, and then I heard a guy named Fred Downing mention it. I used to pay attention when Fred said it, and the motto is, hug your demons or they'll bite you in the ass. Fred is a Lutheran minister, and he has this kind of English, I can't do it, I can't mimic things, but he has this English kind of thing in his voice, and he used to get up there and say, and hug your demons and they'll bite you in the ass. And the way he said that, it sounded like he was saying a saintly word when he said ass. It was real funny. And so I used to listen to him say that all the time. But anyway, hug your demons or they'll bite you in the ass is about embracing reality. Emotions is one part of your reality you better embrace. Now, shame is just an emotion, and a very special one because of what happens to kids when they're abused. Now, shame is different than guilt, often mixed up with guilt, but there's a difference here. When you feel shame, and it's your own shame, it feels like mild to moderate embarrassment. I always remember that when I'm feeling my own shame, I am embarrassed. Nothing more, nothing less. The other thing about shame, and when it's your own shame, is that it comes about when your brain is thinking something. Thinking two things. Number one, I've made a mistake. And number two, somebody else is looking at me as I've made this mistake. In other words, I would probably feel my own shame if I fell off the podium and all of you looked at me, right? But if I fell off the podium and I was in this room all by myself, do you think I'd feel shame? No, I'd probably hurt. And that's it, I'd feel some pain, but I wouldn't feel shame. Shame is a public emotion. Just like how you know how when you pick your nose in the bathroom and nobody else is watching you, how you don't feel shame about that, you just gouge away at yourself. But if somebody you care about happened to see you doing that, what do you think you'd feel? Embarrassed. See, the shame is a public emotion. It's different than guilt. Shame is about embarrassment. Guilt is that gnawing feeling in your gut when you break your own values. They're two very different emotions. In other words, you can feel guilt all by yourself in your closet as you think about how you operated outside your values and broke your own rules. But you cannot feel shame all by yourself in your closet when you're doing something like that. You won't feel anything. You'll just enjoy it. It's only when people see your fallibility, your imperfection, that you feel shame. It's a public thing. But I'm only talking about your own shame. I'm not talking about carried or induced shame. And the important thing to remember is it feels like embarrassment, and the other thing is that as you're feeling your own shame, you do not have a drop in your own sense of worth. Your own sense of value, your own sense of esteem, your own sense of worthwhileness does not take a plunge when you feel your own shame. Shame, another thing I would tell you to get you kind of centered on this issue of shame is that shame alerts you to your own fallibility. In other words, shame tells you your poop smells. That's the other thing shame tells you. Now that's a wonderful statement I just said there. Because what does that do for you? When you know your poop smells, what do you know about everybody else? Theirs does too. And that's wonderful to know that. Why? Because it helps you deal with your perfect imperfection. The only thing perfect about you is your imperfection. When you know your poop smells and you know everybody else's does, do you realize that that's a leveler? It's a leveler. It tells you that everybody else is perfectly imperfect too, and you don't need to worry about it. In other words, everybody makes mistakes. Best thing you can do, by the way, whenever you make a mistake is, and again, you only feel shame when somebody's looking at you and aware that you made a mistake. Best thing to do is own it and say, I screwed up, or you can say something else too. If you like to swear. They can't do anything else to you once you've admitted it. And you can own it. You can own it because you know everybody else makes those kinds of mistakes too. And if they don't own that, something's wrong. If they can't own the fact that they're perfectly imperfect, what do they have? They have a disease called codependence, and they're doing it in front of you right now. So our own shame, it brings us a gift of two things. Since it tells us our poop smells and everybody else does, which gets us comfortable with our perfect imperfection, what it does is it allows us to own ourselves as perfectly imperfect, which allows us to be accountable for who we are. Now that's important. What does accountability mean? Accountability means that we have the ability to note the impact of our behavior on other people, note the impact of our reality on others. So the gift shame brings us is that of accountability. In other words, when we can feel our own shame, it allows us to own who we are and how it affects other people. So the gift it brings is that of accountability. Another wonderful gift that it brings us is spirituality. And that's very important for us too. The reason why it does that is very interesting. I think shame is the source of spirituality, by the way. I have a whole tape series on that. It's a long discussion, and I'll try to tell you about it really briefly. But basically, our own shame tells us our poop smells, which sets us up to be in a relationship with a power greater than self. You realize that when you don't feel shame, you don't need a higher power because you're the higher power. Have you noticed that about shameless people or people that can't feel their shame? They're set up to be a higher power. And it's because they lack shame. Again, shame is what alerts a person to how their reality is impacting others. A shameless person doesn't give a rat fink about how they are affecting others. They think they have a right to go out in that environment and be and do whatever they want to do, that they have a right to take from other people and use other people. That's a shameless person. When you have a shame, when you have the sense of your own shame on board and are able to feel it, as you impact people and impact people adversely and they tell you about it, it's your shame that puts you in the experience of being able to hear others tell you about adverse impact you've had on them. Anybody able to do that would know they need to have a power greater than themselves to help them. Have you noticed that in recovery? It's part of what makes recovery difficult. Have you noticed that about recovery? That on one level, for those of you who feel worthless, feeling better, beginning to feel better and not so worthless is an important thing. But the other thing about it is that in recovery, one of the things we have to do is we have to pay attention to our impact on others. I personally hate to do that. I noticed, for example, in my relationship with Pat, that I can do an inventory on him and feel very free to tell him how aggravating it is to live with him. Mainly it's aggravating because he has different values. And he does things that are different, like I was really aggravated kind of riding over in the car today. I hope he's not here. I don't see him. I can always talk about him better when he's not here. It's easier. Anyway, we're riding in the car, and he likes to play that radio. I think he's deaf or something. He plays it real loud. And what happens to me, because I've got chronic shock syndrome, is that loud talking and all that stuff just after a while just makes me agitated like that, and I just hate it. But is he doing something wrong? No, he's just listening to the radio the way he likes it. I always want to say, hey, let me turn some rock and roll on to jangle your nerves. He likes all that talking. I like the rock and roll, That settles me down. The other stimulates him. Mine stimulates him and settles me down. Who's right, who's wrong? Nobody's right or wrong. But, when I go to tell him about what a nerd he is because he has the radio up like that and all that sort of thing, I feel perfectly free in letting him know what a nerd he is about that kind of thing. However, when he turns to me and says, you really aggravate me, every time I leave the room you ask me a question, so I'm out in the hallway wondering what you're mumbling. You never tell me when I'm standing here looking at you. You always talk to me as I'm walking out the door. What's with you? I always think, what a jerk, what a jerk, what a jerk. What a picky jerk. But I feel very free to talk to him about what a nerd he is. See, it's like the only thing that helps me not do that, which makes me very difficult to deal with when I can't. The only thing that helps me is that sense of shame I have on board. That tells me I'm fallible and that I impact people adversely according to how they process the reality of who I am. There's no right or wrong or good or bad to that. There's just who I am as I'm spinning around in my environment, for example, affecting Pat. Now, it's the shame that I've learned to feel and embrace that allows me to listen to Pat and understand that I am impacting him adversely. Most people in their disease only pay attention to how others are impacting them adversely and don't pay attention to how they're out in the environment affecting others. It's our shame that puts us on alert to how we're impacting others adversely. In other words, especially with people you live with, they're the ones that point out all your imperfection, don't they? Like me talking to him as he's walked out the door. Or putting his coffee cup away before he's done drinking because I like things neat. Or all those other things I do, like putting his stools away. We have this long battle going on. We have built 2 extra rooms on our house to settle the fight, and I don't think it's going to work. My husband likes to create these piles so he can find things. What he does is he puts everything in these piles all over the house. Anybody's been to our house, have seen these piles. It's embarrassing to me. Finally, I stopped having anybody over because I didn't want them to see them. I was taught in my family of origin, and my sister here will tell you this is true, that you put everything away, and when you don't, you're a pig. They used to call us pigs because we didn't clean our rooms properly. Anyway, so I put things away to find it. He puts them in piles to find it, and we conflict. Now, who's right or who's wrong? Who's good or bad? Who's blah, 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 blah? Neither one. His system is just as neat as mine, isn't it? I mean, I think that's creative to make piles, don't you, to find things? That's true. That is very creative. Most people will identify my husband as a creative man. On the other hand, isn't it creative to put it away so you can find it? See, it's neither right or wrong or good or bad, but it's each of us being able to experience our own shame that allows us to be able to hear how we impact others adversely. So shame, one of the great gifts it gives us is that it teaches us or allows us to be accountable for who we are, know our poop smells so that we can not only be accountable, we have then the ability to invite a higher power into our life to help us out because we're not the higher power. Okay? So shame brings us spirituality and accountability. There's another thing that I want to mention, and that's about around shame and spirituality, and that's about how I discovered my own sense of spirituality. Let me define spirituality for you so you have some understanding what I'm talking about. I think spirituality is about a moment of being in a relationship with a power greater than self and greater than your parents. That when you are experiencing the relationship is bringing you guidance, solace, and or serenity. I certainly had trouble being a spiritual person prior to recovery. Couldn't do it at all and hated anybody to talk about God. And I discovered it in 12-step meetings I attended because 2 things are going on in those meetings. If you ever paid attention to what's going on and everybody follows that no crosstalk rule, is you'll find that everybody is there blabbing away, no matter what meeting you go to, blabbing away about their issues of imperfection, and people are listening without interfering with what they're saying, without judging them and putting them down. Everybody keeps their mouth shut. Half the time, everybody is laughing or crying about what they're talking about, as they let out their own imperfection, everybody feels better because it's a leveler. Everybody is knowing that everybody kind of does their disease the same way, and so everybody feels good. And what they do is, because that's the attitude, share your imperfection. What it does is gives everybody an invitation to put it out there, put their imperfection out there, and they know they won't be judged. Then what comes back to is information about how people went beyond their imperfection and grew up. So in that process of an open invitation to put out who you are, as a result of that, you get gifts back that help you grow up, but as you get the gifts back too, you make connection with others. As you share, you make connections with others. That's why spirituality, I think, is about relationship. It's about being connected and sharing and receiving from others. That's how it started for me in those meetings. Eventually, because I was following the 12 steps, which are all spiritual in nature, I developed a relationship with a power greater than myself because I followed the rules around those steps. But before I could do any of that, I had to come to terms with my own shame and be willing to feel it. It enabled me to put out there into the environment who I was and be okay with that and all my perfect imperfection. It's probably one of the reasons why I have a lot of people kind of enjoy listening to my tapes. The steady feedback I get is, Pia, you sure put out there who you are and all your imperfection, don't you? And I said, sure. And the reason why I can do that is because I can feel my own shame. And I don't care if you see that my poop smells. I pay attention to one thing, and that's the level it is smelling. When it smells real bad, I will tell you I don't tell you about it. I admit it to the person who is really smelling it, and I make amends for having done that to him, whatever it is. In terms of shame then, and how it allows you to be accountable, what you have to pay attention to is how much shame you're feeling. If you're feeling very intense shame, what are you going to know? You're going to know you've done something kind of crappy to somebody else, aren't you? And it's affecting them adversely. What do you know to do? You know you can stop the behavior and make amends. That's the gift of shame. And it's a very, very important emotion. Again, when it's your own, you got to pay attention to whether it's shame or guilt. Guilt's a gnawing sense in your gut. It comes about when you break your own rules. Shame, however, is a sense of embarrassment that comes about when somebody else is noticing how imperfect you are. In other words, when you make mistakes and others are knowing about it, you feel shame. Sometimes when you've broken your own rules and people know about it, you feel shame as well as guilt. But guilt can be felt all by yourself. Your own shame is only experienced when somebody else is looking at you making a mistake. So shame is an emotion, and that's it. It's no more important really than that, and it comes about when your brain is telling you you've made a mistake. Now let me move on and talk about how this issue of shame is bound to the disease of codependence. It actually has to do with what happens in child abuse and how our feelings, and it has to do also again with feelings. And it's about the second half of the title of this particular series. Remember I told you shame, a gift from God? The reason why I say shame is a gift from God is because it allows you to be a spiritual person and allows you to be accountable. But the second half of that title is shame, legacy of abuse. This is about how it's the legacy of abuse. See, shame is positive and negative. When it's your own, it's positive. When it is not your own and is somebody else's, it becomes negative. That's the issue and becomes a legacy of abuse. It happens because of what we call carried or induced feeling reality. The principle around that is this, that whenever we as a human being are around another person who refuses to feel their feelings or who is outrageous with their own feelings. In other words, when we are around another human being and they're not dealing with their emotions properly, what happens as they refuse to embrace their feelings is they radiate them out very, very intensely. If we as codependents are around people doing that and have failed to develop our internal boundary, when we get near those people, we have a tendency to take that emotion on from them, add it to our own, and go on overwhelm. Now, that particular dynamic sets up problems with our feeling reality. Codependents, by and large, feel their feelings 4 different ways. They don't feel feelings normally. They don't feel feelings just from as they think they create their feelings. They feel feelings 4 different ways, which complicates the disease. But the reason why they feel 2 of these feelings is because of that principle. That when a human being without good internal boundaries is around another who's in denial of or being irresponsible with their feeling reality, the person has a tendency to take that feeling reality on because they're so intensely radiated from others. Now, let's go back to codependence being caused by child abuse. What we know in abusive homes is that whenever a major caregiver is irresponsible with or in denial of his or her own feelings,